In the Vietnam War, the US Army tried to build a machine that could smell people hiding in the jungle. It sounds like a detail from science fiction, but the idea came from a very real problem. In Vietnam, the landscape often defeated ordinary military logic. Dense vegetation could hide footpaths, tunnels could hide people. A clearing that looked empty might not be empty at all. Patrols moved through a world where sight was limited. Sound was confusing, and danger could feel close without being visible. So American planners looked for ways to turn the jungle into data. By the 1960s, the military was already interested in sensors, machines could listen for movement, aircraft could photograph terrain, electronic devices could be dropped, carried or mounted to vehicles. The hope was simple: if human senses were not enough, perhaps technology could extend them. One of the strangest results was known informally as the people-sniffer. Its official descriptions varied, but the basic concept was a personnel detector. Not a detector for weapons, not a detector for vehicles, a detector for human presence. The strange part was what it tried to detect. Human bodies leave chemical traces. Sweat, urine, breath, and waste can release compounds into the air. One important target was ammonia, which could be associated with human activity. If a machine could detect those traces, then maybe it could suggest where people had recently been. That was the promise. The battlefield would no longer be only something soldiers saw. It would become something machines sampled. The air itself would become evidence. Some versions were explored as equipment carried near the ground. Others were adapted for helicopters, where air could be pulled into sensors while flying over difficult terrain. The result was an invention that sat somewhere between chemistry surveillance and desperation. It mattered because it shows how war can push technology into odd corners. A simple question became a strange engineering challenge. How do you find someone you cannot see in a place designed by nature to conceal them? The answer for a time was to try smelling the jungle, but turning human presence into a chemical signal was only the beginning. The harder question was whether the machine actually understood what it was smelling. The people-sniffer did not smell people the way a dog would. It did something colder, stranger, and more mechanical. Air was drawn into the device inside sensors, looked for chemical signs that could suggest human activity. Nearby, if the concentration rose above a certain level, the machine could alert its operator. Through reading a signal or a change that demanded attention, in theory that made sense. A hidden camp might produce traces. A recently used trail might leave traces. People living, moving, resting, or relieving themselves in the landscape could alter the chemistry of the surrounding air. But the jungle was not a clean laboratory. It was wet, hot, alive, and chemically noisy. Rotting vegetation could affect the air. Animals could leave traces. Civilians might be nearby. Friendly soldiers could contaminate the reading. A latrine, a village, or an old campsite might create a signal that meant something very different from what the operator feared. This was the central weakness of the device. It could suggest that something was there. It could not always explain what that something was. Mounted on a helicopter, the problem became even stranger. The aircraft could cover ground quickly, but the air it sampled was being disturbed by movement height, weather, and rotor wash. A possible signal might appear, vanish, or drift. The machine was not pointing to a person like an arrow. It was interpreting invisible chemistry in a chaotic environment. That is what made the invention stand out. It was not just a gadget, it was an attempt to translate uncertainty into numbers. A meter reading could feel more certain than instinct. A device could seem more objective than fear. But a battlefield does not become simple just because a machine gives an answer. The people-sniffer occupied a strange middle ground. It was advanced enough to feel futuristic, yet limited enough to remind everyone how stubborn the real world can be. Reports and later accounts suggest that the device produced mixed results. Sometimes it may have helped identify areas of interest. Other times it could send people chasing a chemical ghost. And once those limitations became clear, the invention's reputation began to change. What had started as a clever answer to the jungle became a lesson in how easily a signal can be mistaken for certainty. The people-sniffer was not remembered because it solved the jungle. It was remembered because it tried. In Vietnam, the device became part of a wider search for technological answers to an unusually difficult war. Sensors, aircraft chemicals, computers, and electronic systems were all used in different ways to reduce uncertainty. The people-sniffer belonged to that world. Its promise was powerful. If hidden movement could be detected chemically, then patrols might be warned. Aircraft might locate activity below the canopy. A place that seemed empty might reveal a human trace. But the field was harsher than the theory. The detector could not reliably distinguish between every possible source of the chemicals it sensed. It could not tell the operator whether a reading came from armed opponents, civilians, animals, old waste, or environmental conditions. It could not turn a complicated landscape into a simple truth. There were also accounts that opposing forces learned how to complicate its use. The exact details vary in later retellings, but the broader point is believable. Once a detection method is understood, people try to evade it, confuse it, or exploit its weaknesses. That is the old contest between invention and adaptation. The people-sniffer did not become a famous turning point. It did not transform the war. It faded into the larger archive of unusual military technology, remembered mostly by historians, veterans and readers drawn to strange inventions. But its legacy is more interesting than failure. It reveals a recurring human desire. When events become too confusing, we build instruments and ask them to make the world legible. We ask machines to hear what we cannot hear, see what we cannot see, and in this case, smell what we cannot smell. Modern sensing technology is far more advanced than the devices used in Vietnam. Chemical detection, remote sensing drones, and surveillance systems all belong to a much larger technological story. But the lesson remains familiar. A sensor can gather evidence, it cannot remove judgment. The strangest part of the people-sniffer is not that the army built it. The strangest part is that the idea was perfectly logical for the problem it faced. In the end, it was a machine built to find certainty in the air. And history is full of inventions like that, strange, serious, and born from the fear of not knowing what is hidden nearby.